HOA cops stopped an ambulance and cost a man his life. The siren was deafening, slicing through the laughter and music of the Oakwood Meadows block party like a knife. Red and blue lights flashed in my face, and the EMT in the ambulance screamed something I couldn't make out over the noise. I stood there, hands gripping the barricade on Meadow Lane, my heart pounding. "No vehicles through the party zone," I shouted back, my voice steady but my gut twisting. It was the rule, my rule. The one I'd sworn to uphold as the HOA's compliance officer. But in that moment, with the ambulance's horn blaring and a man's life hanging by a thread just a few blocks away, I didn't know I was about to make the worst mistake of my life. My name's Danny Harper, and I used to think rules were what kept our little Ohio suburb perfect. Lawns mowed, houses uniform, chaos at bay. Oakwood Meadows was my pride, and I was its gatekeeper. That day I thought I was doing my job, protecting our community's order. I didn't know I'd end up with blood on my hands, or that I'd spend every day after trying to wash it off. This is the story of how one decision, one moment, changed everything. Not just for me, but for a family, a neighborhood, and the rules we thought we needed. If you're gripped by stories that dig into the heart of what it means to be human, hit that subscribe button and join our community of storytellers. Every week we unravel tales like this, raw, real, and full of lessons that stick with you. Let's dive into the weight of rules and find out what happens when the rules we live by start to break us. I can still hear that siren in my head even now, months later, when I'm sweeping petals off the floor of my flower shop. It's not just the sound, it's the weight of it, the way it screamed for me to move, to act, to feel something. But I didn't. I stood there, clutching that damn barricade, believing I was right. To understand why I made that choice, you need to know who I was before that day. You need to know about Oakwood Meadows, the rules I live by, and the man I thought I was. My name's Danny Harper, and for 5 years, I was the compliance officer for the Oakwood Meadows Homeowners Association in a quiet corner of Ohio. Oakwood's the kind of place you see in real estate ads. Tidy houses with white shutters, kids riding bikes, neighbors waving over picket fences. But underneath the postcard perfection, there was a rule book thicker than a Bible. No lawn ornaments taller than 2 feet. No exterior paint without HOA approval. No parking on the street past midnight. The HOA ran this place like a military base, and I was their foot soldier. I didn't grow up dreaming of being the rule police. I was just a guy who liked things orderly. My dad was a mechanic, always preaching a place for everything, and everything in its place. After high school, I bounced around, security gigs, a stint at a warehouse, until I landed the HOA job. It came with a decent paycheck, a golf cart, and a sense of purpose. I'd cruise the streets, clipboard in hand, checking for violations, a mailbox leaning too far left. I'd write it up a car with an expired tag. I'd call it in. Most folks rolled their eyes, but some thanked me. Keeps the neighborhood classy. They'd say I ate that up. It made me feel like I was holding the world together. Oakwood's biggest event was the annual block party, a mix of county fair and neighborhood brag fest. Picture balloons tied to every lamppost, kids chasing each other with cotton candy, and the smell of grilled hot dogs in the air. The HOA planned it down to the last napkin. No unapproved vendors, no music too loud, and most critically, no vehicles on Meadow Lane, the main stretch where the party was set up. Not even emergency vehicles unless they had a special permit signed by the HOA board. That rule was carved in stone, and I was the one tasked with enforcing it. The morning of the party, I woke up early, put on my khaki uniform, and checked my walkie-talkie. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, the HOA president, called me before I'd even finished my coffee. "Danny," she said, her voice sharp like she was scolding a kid, "today's our biggest day. No disruptions, no vehicles on Meadow Lane, no exceptions. You got that?" "Got it, Mrs. Carter," I said, adjusting my cap. I drove my golf cart to the barricade at the end of Meadow Lane, where the party was already taking shape. Volunteers were setting up tables, stringing lights, and testing the bounce house. I stood there, watching it all come together, feeling like a general overseeing his troops. The rules were my orders, and I wasn't about to let anyone break them. I didn't know then that those orders would lead me to a moment I'd replay every night for the rest of my life. I didn't know that by sunset, I'd be staring into the eyes of a woman whose son was gone because of me. All I knew was that I had a job to do, and I was going to do it right. The siren hit me like a freight train, a wail so loud it drowned out the laughter and music of the Oakwood Meadows block party. It was mid-afternoon, the sun blazing down on a perfect Ohio day. Kids were shrieking in the bounce house, their voices rising over the thump of sneakers on inflatable vinyl A cover band was halfway through a shaky rendition of Sweet Home Alabama, and the air was thick with the smell of grilled hot dogs and melting cotton candy. I stood at the barricade on Meadow Lane, my khaki uniform sticking to my skin, my walkie-talkie buzzing with updates from the HOA crew. Everything was under control. At least it was until that ambulance showed up. I saw the lights first, red and blue, flashing like a warning I didn't want to heed. The ambulance roared toward me, tires screeching as it stopped inches from the metal gate I'd set up that morning. My hand tightened on the barricade, the cold steel grounding me. I knew the rule. No vehicles on Meadow Lane during the block party, no exceptions. It was my job to enforce it, my duty to keep Oakwood's order intact. But when the driver's window rolled down and I saw her face, something in me faltered. She was young, maybe 30, with a blonde ponytail pulled tight and a name tag that read, Sarah. Her eyes were wide, desperate, like she'd seen something I couldn't even imagine. "Move the gate," she shouted, her voice cracking over the siren's wail. "We've got a crash on Main Street male. 25. Critical, he's bleeding out. We need to get through now." My stomach twisted, a knot I couldn't untie. I opened my mouth, but the words came out automatic, like I was reading from the HOA handbook. "You can't go through here," I said, raising my voice to be heard. "It's a restricted zone. Take the detour around Elm Street." Sarah blinked like I'd slapped her. "Are you kidding me?" she yelled, leaning out the window. "The detour's 10 minutes. This guy doesn't have 10 minutes. Move the damn gate, or he's dead." The crowd around us froze. A mom pushing a stroller stopped mid-step. A dad holding a plastic cup of beer turned, his eyebrows raised. A kid with a sparkler paused, the light fizzing in his hand. Their eyes bored into me, but I felt another weight, Mrs. Evelyn Carter's voice, sharp and unyielding, echoing from that morning's call. No disruptions, no vehicles, no exceptions. I'd seen her fire a guy for less, a maintenance worker who let a pizza delivery scoot through during a board meeting. My job was all I had. My place in Oakwood was all I had. "His name's Ryan Carter." Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. "He's 25, engaged, works at the engineering firm downtown. He's got a mom waiting for him to come home tonight. You're gonna let him die over some stupid rule?" Ryan Carter. The name sliced through me, sharp and personal. I didn't know him, but I could see him in my mind. A kid with a quick smile, maybe tossing a football at last year's block party, planning a wedding with his fiancée. For a split second, I was 16 again, standing in my dad's garage, watching him clutch his chest, his face gray as he gasped, "Call 911, Danny." I'd fumbled the phone, too scared to move fast enough. The ambulance came too late. He was gone before I could say goodbye. I shoved the memory down, hard. This wasn't about me. This was about the rules. "Take the detour," I said, my voice colder now, like I was trying to convince myself. "It's protocol, you'll get there." Sarah's face twisted. Anger, disbelief, something close to hatred. "You're killing him," she spat. "You hear me? His blood's on you." She slammed her fist on the steering wheel, threw the ambulance into reverse, and peeled out, the tires screaming as she sped toward Elm Street. The siren faded, swallowed by the party noise, but it lingered in my head, a ghost I couldn't shake. I turned back to the crowd, my hands shaking. The band struck up a new song, something upbeat and wrong. A kid ran by, waving his sparkler, leaving a trail of light. The mom with the stroller started walking again, but she shot me a look. Disgust, maybe pity. I wanted to yell that I was just doing my job, that the rules were there to protect us all. But my throat was tight and my chest felt like it was caving in. I tried to go back to work. I checked the vendor permits, made sure the bounce house wasn't over capacity. But every few minutes, I glanced down Meadow Lane, half expecting the ambulance to come back. I kept hearing Sarah's voice. "He's bleeding out." I kept seeing my dad's face, gray and still. 10 minutes. Was it really that long? Elm Street wasn't that far. She had to be exaggerating. The hospital was close. They'd make it. I repeated it like a prayer, but it felt hollow. Then the walkie-talkie crackled. It was Tom, the HOA guy on parking duty. "Danny, you hear about the crash on Main?" he said, his voice low, like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "Ambulance didn't get there in time. Kid didn't make it." The world tilted. I grabbed the barricade to steady myself, the metal biting into my palms. "Who was it?" I asked, though I already knew my voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. "Ryan Carter," Tom said. 25 real shame cops said he was pinned in the car, lost too much blood if they'd gotten there a few minutes sooner. He kept talking, but I didn't hear the rest. Ryan Carter. 25 engaged, a mom waiting for him. I saw Sarah's face again, her eyes burning with rage. I saw the ambulance lights disappearing down Elm. And then I saw something else. A woman, maybe Ryan's mom, standing in a hospital hallway, hearing the words no one should ever hear. My knees buckled and I leaned against the barricade, my breath shallow. The party went on around me, laughter, music, the clink of beer bottles. But it felt like I was underwater, drowning in a truth I couldn't face. I told myself I was just following orders. I told myself the rules were there for a reason. If I'd let the ambulance through, the party could have been disrupted. Someone could have gotten hurt. But none of it held up. Not when I closed my eyes and saw Ryan's face. Imagined him fighting for one more breath. Not when I heard Sarah's voice accusing me. "His blood's on you." I didn't know it then, but that moment would haunt me for the rest of my life. It would drive me out of Oakwood, away from the rules I'd built my world around. It would send me to a flower shop, to a graveyard, to a place where I'd beg for forgiveness I didn't deserve. But right then, standing at that barricade, all I could do was try to keep breathing. Try to pretend I hadn't just made the worst mistake a man could make. The music from the block party faded, but the siren never did. It followed me home that night, a ghost in my head, screaming louder than any crowd. I sat in my living room, the TV off, the beer in my hand untouched. Ryan Carter was dead. 25 years old, gone because I'd stood by a rule, a flimsy piece of paper that meant nothing. Now I kept seeing Sarah's face, the EMT, her eyes burning with rage as she'd cursed me. "His blood's on you." I wanted to argue, to say I was just doing my job, but the words stuck in my throat like broken glass. Deep down, I knew she was right. The next morning, Oakwood Meadows wasn't the same. The balloons from the party were gone. The bounce house deflated, but the air felt heavier, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. I drove my golf cart to the HOA office, expecting Mrs. Evelyn Carter to call me in, maybe even fire me, but she didn't. Instead, she handed me a stack of violation notices to hand out, business as usual. "Keep your head down, Danny," she said, her voice clipped. "This will blow over." I nodded, but I didn't believe her. Nothing was blowing over. Not for me, and definitely not for Ryan's family. I learned about Ryan through the whispers that spread like wildfire. He was a local kid, born and raised in Oakwood, a mechanical engineer, worked downtown, always tinkering with car engines in his garage. He'd proposed to his high school sweetheart, Emily, just 3 months ago. A ring he'd saved 2 years to buy his mom. Linda was a nurse at the county hospital. His dad, Tom, coached Little League. They were the kind of family you saw at every block party, passing out homemade cookies, cheering at the sack race. Now they were the family who'd lost everything. Linda was the first to speak out. By noon the next day, her post on the Oakwood Meadows Facebook group had gone viral, at least by our small-town standards. "My son is dead," she wrote, her words raw and jagged. "Ryan was bleeding out on Main Street, and the HOA stopped the ambulance from saving him. They cared more about their precious block party than a human life. Shame on you, Oakwood. Shame on all of you. The post had hundreds of likes, shares, comments, some offering condolences, others demanding answers. Who was at the gate? One comment asked, "Who let this happen?" My name wasn't out there yet, but I felt it coming, like a storm I couldn't outrun. The local paper, the Oakwood Gazette, picked up the story, "Tragedy at Block Party, HOA Rule. Delays Ambulance." The headline read. They didn't name me either, but they quoted Linda. The man at the barricade wouldn't budge. He said it was protocol. My son paid the price for their protocol. I read the article at my kitchen table, my hands shaking so bad I spilled my coffee. The comments online were worse. Fire the HOA board. One said, "Whoever blocked that ambulance should be in jail." Another wrote, "I wanted to scream that it wasn't that simple, that I was just following orders. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ryan's face. Not his real face, but the one I'd imagined, pale and still, fighting for one last breath." The community turned on the HOA faster than I'd ever seen. By the end of the week, there were protests outside the HOA office. Nothing huge, just a dozen or so neighbors with signs, "Rules don't trump lives, justice for Ryan." I stayed away, but I saw it on the news. Linda standing at the front, her face drawn but fierce. She wasn't just grieving, she was fighting. She and Tom hired a lawyer, a guy from Columbus who specialized in wrongful death cases. They were suing the HOA for negligence, claiming the delay caused Ryan's death. I heard Mrs. Carter talking about it on the phone, her voice low and angry. "They don't have a case," she said. "We followed protocol. No judge will touch this." But the lawsuit wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the way Oakwood looked at me. I'd always been the guy who kept things in line, the one they grumbled about but respected. Now I was the guy who'd let a kid die. Neighbors stopped waving when I drove by. The cashier at the grocery store, a woman I'd known for years, wouldn't meet my eyes. Even Tom, the HOA parking guy, started avoiding me. Like my guilt was contagious, I stopped going to the diner on weekends, stopped walking my dog in the park. I felt like a stranger in the place I'd spent 5 years protecting. The trial came 3 months later, a gray November day that matched the weight in my chest. I was called as a witness, the only one who'd been at the barricade. The courtroom was small, packed with reporters, neighbors, and Ryan's family. Linda sat in the front row, her hands clasped tight, her eyes red but dry. Tom was next to her, his arm around her shoulders, his face carved with grief. Emily, Ryan's fiancée, was there too, clutching a tissue, her engagement ring glinting under the fluorescent lights. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Their pain was a mirror, reflecting back every choice I'd made. The HOA's lawyer, a slick guy in a tailored suit, coached me beforehand. "Stick to the facts, Danny," he said. "You followed protocol. That's all that matters." So I did. I took the stand, swore on a Bible, and told the truth, or at least the version that fit the HOA's story. I informed the EMT that Meadow Lane was closed per HOA regulations. I said, my voice flat, like I was reading a script. I directed them to the detour on Elm Street. It was standard procedure. The lawyer for Ryan's family, a wiry man with sharp eyes, didn't let me off easy. "Mr. Harper," he said, pacing in front of the stand, "you knew there was a man dying a few blocks away. You heard the EMT beg you to move the gate. Why didn't you?" I swallowed, my mouth dry. "It was the rule," I said. "No vehicles during the block party. I was doing my job." "Your job," he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Did your job include letting a 25-year-old bleed out in a wrecked car? Did it include telling a mother she'd never see her son again?" The courtroom was silent, but I felt Linda's eyes on me, boring through me. I wanted to say I was sorry, that I hadn't meant for this to happen, that I'd give anything to go back and move that gate. But the words wouldn't come. I just sat there, my hands clenched, while the lawyer tore into me. "You chose a rule over a life, Mr. Harper. How do you sleep at night?" I didn't, not anymore. That night I lay awake, replaying the trial, Linda's stare, the lawyer's words. I saw Ryan's face again, not just in my imagination, but in a photo from the newspaper. A smiling kid with a baseball cap, arm around Emily at a 4th of July picnic. I saw my dad too, his last moments, the way I'd failed him. The guilt was a weight I couldn't carry, but I didn't know how to put it down. The trial ended in a blur. The judge ruled in favor of the HOA, no direct evidence. He said, no proof that the detour caused Ryan's death. The EMT's testimony, Sarah's testimony, wasn't enough. The HOA's protocol was reasonable, the judge said, and I'd acted within it. Mrs. Carter was smug, shaking hands with the lawyer like they'd won a game. But it didn't feel like a victory. Not when Linda collapsed in Tom's arms outside the courthouse, sobbing so hard I thought she'd break. Not when Emily walked away, her ring now a reminder of a future she'd never have. The community didn't let it go. The protests grew louder, angrier. Someone spray-painted murderers on the HOA office door. The Gazette ran op-eds calling for reform, for the HOA to be disbanded. Linda kept posting online, sharing stories about Ryan, how he'd fixed her car for free, how he'd planned to name his first kid after his dad. Each post was a knife twisting deeper. I stopped checking Facebook, stopped leaving my house unless I had to, but I couldn't escape the truth. I'd made a choice, and that choice had destroyed a family. One night I drove past the spot on Main Street where Ryan's car had crashed. The skid marks were still there, faint but visible under the streetlights. I pulled over, got out, and stood there, the cold November air biting my skin. I didn't know what I was looking for. Forgiveness, answers, a way to undo it all. All I found was silence, and the weight of a name I'd never forget. Ryan Carter. I thought the worst was over, that the guilt would fade with time. I was wrong. It was only the beginning. The real punishment wasn't the protest or the trial. It was what came next, when I had to face myself, when I had to find a way to live with what I'd done, or find a way to make it right. The skid marks on Main Street haunted me, but it was Linda Carter's eyes that broke me. I'd seen them in the courtroom, red-rimmed and fierce, cutting through me like I was nothing. They followed me home, into my dreams, into the quiet moments when I tried to pretend I was still the same Danny Harper who kept Oakwood Meadows in line. But I wasn't that guy anymore. I wasn't sure I ever had been. Ryan Carter's death had stripped away the rules I'd hidden behind, leaving me raw and exposed, with nowhere to run but forward. A week after the trial, I walked into the HOA office and quit. Mrs. Evelyn Carter was there, sipping coffee, her desk piled with complaint letters about the protests. "You're making a mistake, Danny," she said, her voice sharp but tired. "This'll die down and people forget." I didn't argue. I just slid my badge and walkie-talkie across her desk and walked out. The air outside felt cleaner, like I'd shed a skin I'd outgrown. But the weight of what I'd done didn't lift. It never would. I didn't know what to do with myself after that. Oakwood wasn't home anymore. Neighbors still avoided me, their glances sharp with judgment. The diner, the park, the grocery store, every place I'd once belonged now felt like a minefield I stayed inside. Blinds drawn, replaying that day at the barricade, Sarah's voice. "His blood's on you," Linda's post. "My son is dead." Ryan's face, the one from the newspaper, smiling under a baseball cap. I wanted to fix it, to make it right. But how do you fix a life that's gone? One morning I drove past a flower shop on the edge of town, a little place called Petals and Promises. The sign was faded, the windows dusty, but something about it stopped me. I'd never cared much for flowers, but I remembered Linda's Facebook post about Ryan, how he'd loved daisies, the white ones, because they reminded him of his mom's garden. I went inside, bought a bouquet of white daisies, and drove to Oakwood Cemetery. I didn't know what I was doing, just that I needed to be there. Ryan's grave was new, the earth still soft, the headstone simple. Ryan Thomas Carter, 1999-2024, beloved son and fiancé. I stood there clutching the daisies, feeling like an intruder. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for this to happen." The words felt empty, like they couldn't reach him. I laid the flowers down, their white petals stark against the dark soil, and left before anyone could see me. That became my ritual. Once a month, I'd buy daisies and visit Ryan's grave. I never stayed long, just long enough to say I was sorry, to promise I'd do better. The cemetery was quiet, a place where guilt could breathe without judgment. But it wasn't enough. I needed more than apologies. I needed to change. I went back to Petals and Promises and asked the owner, an old woman named Marjorie, if she needed help. She looked me up and down, her eyes narrowing like she knew my story. "You're the HOA guy," she said, not unkindly. I nodded, bracing for a lecture, but she just handed me an apron. "Start by sweeping the floor." I did, and then I stayed. A week later, I bought the shop from her with my savings. It wasn't much, a cramped space with creaky floors and a leaky roof, but it was mine. I spent my days arranging roses, trimming lilies, learning the language of flowers. Daisies became my favorite, though I never told anyone why the shop gave me purpose. But it didn't erase the past. One spring afternoon, 6 months after the trial, I was at the cemetery placing another bouquet on Ryan's grave. When I heard footsteps, I turned and saw Linda Carter. She was alone carrying a small bunch of wildflowers, her face softer than I remembered, but still etched with grief. My heart stopped. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. She saw me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then she said, "You're here a lot." Her voice was quiet, not accusing, but it hit me like a punch. I nodded, my throat tight. "I didn't know you came," I managed. She looked at the daisies on Ryan's grave, then back at me. "He loved those," she said. "How'd you know?" "I read your post," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "About Ryan. About the daisies." Konawanta, she nodded, her eyes distant. We stood there, the silence heavy but not hostile. I wanted to say 1,000 things, to beg for forgiveness, to explain why I'd done it, to tell her I'd give anything to take it back. But before I could, she spoke. "Ryan was my only child," she said, her voice steady but raw. "He was the kind of kid who'd stop to help a stranger change a tire, who'd spend his weekends fixing cars for free. He was going to marry Emily, start a family. He had plans. Danny. And now he's here, under this dirt, because of a rule." Her words cut deeper than the lawyers in court. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I didn't wipe them away. "I'm sorry," I said, the words spilling out. "I was wrong. I thought I was doing my job. But I was wrong. I'd do anything to change it." Linda looked at me, her eyes searching mine. I waited for her to yell, to curse me like Sarah had, but she didn't. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said finally. "Not yet, maybe not ever. But I see you here every month with those flowers. That means something." She paused, then added, "Don't stop coming." She walked away, leaving me with the daisies and a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a crack in the wall between us. I went back to the shop that day and worked until midnight, arranging bouquets for a wedding, losing myself in the rhythm of petals and stems. For the first time, I felt like I was building something. Not just tearing it down. I started going to community meetings after that. The ones where neighbors were still pushing to reform the HOA. I wasn't sure I belonged, but I went anyway, sitting in the back, listening to people like Linda demand change. One night I stood up. My hands shook, but I spoke. "My name's Danny Harper," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm the one who stopped the ambulance that day. I was wrong. I followed a rule instead of my heart, and Ryan paid the price. I'm here because I want to help make things right." The room was quiet, but it wasn't the hostile silence I'd feared. A woman named Carla, who'd organized the protests, nodded at me. "Takes guts to say that," she said. "Stay. We need you." I did. We drafted proposals to loosen the HOA's rules. Emergency vehicles first, then things like fewer fines for minor violations. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I kept visiting Ryan's grave, kept bringing daisies. Sometimes I'd see Linda or Emily there, and we'd nod, a silent acknowledgement that we were tied together, whether we wanted to be or not. I didn't expect forgiveness, but I kept showing up, Hoping my actions could speak louder than my mistakes, the flower shop became my sanctuary, a place where I could create something beautiful out of pain. But the real work I knew was still ahead, facing a community I'd let down and finding a way to live with the man I'd become. The daisies on Ryan Carter's grave never wilted in my mind. They were always there, white and fragile, a quiet promise I'd made to a man I'd never met, but would carry with me forever. A year had passed since that day at the barricade, since I'd stood in the way of an ambulance and let a rule steal a life. Oakwood Meadows had changed, and so had I. But change doesn't erase the past. It just gives you a chance to build something new on top of it. The protests in the trial had left scars on our little suburb, but they also lit a fire. The community didn't let Ryan's death fade into a headline. Linda Carter, with her fierce grace, kept his memory alive, posting stories about him on the Oakwood Facebook group, how he'd once rebuilt a neighbor's lawnmower for free, how he'd dreamed of opening his own garage. Those stories weren't just memories. They were a call to action. Neighbors started showing up to HOA meetings, not just to complain, but to demand reform. Carla, the protest organizer, led the charge, passing around petitions to rewrite the rulebook. I went to every meeting, sitting in the back, speaking up when I could. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. The HOA buckled under the pressure. Mrs. Evelyn Carter resigned 6 months after the trial, citing health reasons, though everyone knew it was the community's fury that pushed her out. The new board, led by a quiet accountant named Greg, took a hard look at the rules. The first to go was the ban on emergency vehicles during events. "Never again," Greg said at a town hall, his voice firm. They also slashed fines for minor violations. No more tickets for a trash can left out an extra day or a basketball hoop an inch too close to the curb. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The biggest change came in the form of a check. The HOA, facing a PR nightmare and the threat of more lawsuits, offered Linda and Tom Carter a settlement. It wasn't an admission of guilt, their lawyer was careful to say, just a gesture of goodwill. I heard it was enough to cover Ryan's medical bills and then some. Linda didn't want the money. She told the Gazette she'd rather have her son back, but she and Tom accepted it, donating half to a local EMT training program in Ryan's name. "He'd have wanted that," Linda said. I read her words and felt a pang, knowing I'd had a hand in their pain, but also a flicker of pride that they'd turned it into something good. Oakwood held a memorial for Ryan on the anniversary of his death, right there on Meadow Lane, where I'd stood with that barricade. It wasn't a block party, no music, no bounce house, just a quiet gathering under a gray April sky. Linda and Tom were there, along with Emily, Ryan's fiancée, whose engagement ring still glinted on her finger. Neighbors came too, more than I'd expected, holding candles that flickered in the evening breeze. Carla asked me to speak, and I almost said no. What right did I have? But Linda nodded when I looked at her, so I stepped forward, my hands shaking. "I'm Danny Harper," I said, my voice low but steady. "I'm the one who stopped the ambulance that day. I thought I was following the rules, doing my job. I was wrong. Ryan paid the price for my mistake, and I'll carry that for the rest of my life. But standing here, seeing all of you, seeing what we've changed together, I know we're doing right by him. Rules are meant to serve people, not break them. Let's keep that promise to Ryan." The crowd was silent, but it wasn't the cold silence of the courtroom. It was something warmer, something shared. Linda stepped up next, her voice soft but clear. "Ryan was my heart," she said. "Losing him broke us, but seeing this community come together, seeing these changes, it's what he'd have wanted. Thank you, all of you. And Danny," she added, looking at me, "thank you for being here." Her words hit me like a wave, not forgiveness, but close enough to feel like grace. We lit candles one by one until Meadow Lane glowed with tiny flames. Emily placed a bouquet of white daisies at a small plaque they'd installed. "In memory of Ryan Carter, 1990 to 2024. I stood back, watching, feeling like I was part of something bigger than my guilt. I kept running Petals and Promises, my little flower shop on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was home. I'd learned to arrange bouquets that made brides cry and mothers smile. But the daisies were always for Ryan. I visited his grave every month, sometimes seeing Linda or Emily there, sometimes alone. We didn't talk much, just nodded, a quiet understanding that we were bound by loss and healing. The guilt never left me, but it got lighter, like a stone I'd learned to carry. One day as I was closing the shop, I saw an ambulance speed down the street, its siren wailing, its lights flashing. No barricades stopped it, no rules held it back. I watched it disappear around the corner, and for the first time in a year I smiled. Oakwood had changed. I had changed. Ryan's death had cost us all, but it had taught us something too. Rules are only as good as the people they protect. That's the story of The Weight of Rules, a story about mistakes, redemption, and the power of a community to rise above its flaws. It's a reminder that our choices matter, that compassion must always come before protocol. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the rules we live by, then stick around. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of storytellers on YouTube, where we dive into tales like this every week, raw, real, and full of heart. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done at that barricade? What rules in your life need to change? Let's keep the conversation going, and I'll see you in the next story.